We are all fundamentally selling our bodies in some way, but selling your body to the government, especially by enlisting in the army of the evil US empire, which, like the long-dead not-so-great British Empire, has wreaked havoc and terror across the world, is arguably the worst.
We have OnlyFans, and then we have like the sex work industry, and then we have like actors. Is there a difference between these industries, or are we all fundamentally selling our body in some way?
Honestly, I think that selling your body, like if we're going by that definition, being in the army is worse than being on OnlyFans.
Wow.
You're selling your body to the government.
This article by Carlos Garrido explains it best. It reads, "History teaches us that empires can never explicitly affirm the real reasons for their imperial pursuits. It is impossible to get a population of dispossessed people to support sending their children to war when you are open about which class of people is ultimately benefiting from it." It was Plato in his Republic who had already noted that states whose economic foundation is grounded on the endless acquisition of money find it that they must seize some of their neighbours' land. This economic drive inevitably leads to war, and when the rich wage war, as Jean-Paul Sartre said, it is the poor who die. This is true of any of the societies that have been fractured by class. There is always a class of people that does the profiting, and a class that does the dying in times of war. The ruling elites of the warring states have never been able to explicitly announce the economic reasons behind war. The legitimation for war has always had to include a deception of the general public. Aeschylus was correct to say that, in war, truth is the first casualty. Upholding war always required a narrative that can be spun to manufacture the consent of the governed. The ancient Greeks and the British Empire justified war efforts and colonisation through noble, almost humanitarian-like, appeals to civilising the barbarians. Those that were of their ilk were always the ones that were fully human, and those that weren't carried the stench of barbaric otherness on them. From Hellenisation to the empire where the sun never set, colonial war was itself presented as an act of charity and goodwill. You should be thankful that we have expended our valuable resources civilising you. Paradoxically, expansionist wars have also often taken the form of a defensive enterprise. The Roman Empire frequently resorted to the need to protect oneself from barbarian external threats to justify expansion. Offence is often presented as the best form of defence. It is by conquering that we can keep our people at home safe. During the Punic Wars, for example, colonial expansion was legitimised as an attempt to counter the Carthaginian threat. The ideological legitimation of the not-so-Cold War in the 20th century took the same form. It was imperial looting and conquests justified by presenting these as defensive measures of preventing the spread of communism. Offence was once again masqueraded as defence. In the modern era, we have seen a consistent combination of both by the US empire, although at any given moment it could be either the offence as defence or the humanitarian conquest, which could take dominance over the other. For instance, during the Iraq War, offence as defence was the model that proved most effective. Yes, we still had a contingent of the humanitarian conquest justification model that appealed to the need to help oppressed women or bring democracy to the region. But this played ultimately a secondary role to the fear of the brown, Muslim other that the ruling class was able to fabricate in the population, especially after 9/11. This fear was pivotal for the offence as defence model of legitimation. As Bush said in the West Point speech, June 1st, 2002, "If we wait for threats to fully materialise, we will have waited too long. We must take the battle to the enemy, disrupt his plans, and confront the worst threats before they emerge." The dominance of the offence as defence model left a bad taste on the mouths of Americans, who came in time to unanimously oppose the Iraq War, realising it was a war for oil and the control of oil markets, not to defend us from the fabricated dangers of weapons of mass destruction. This allowed the ruling class to pivot toward the humanitarian model as the key form the legitimation for war will take. Assad had to be toppled because he was gassing his people. Cuba had to be overthrown because it was repressing the black artists of the Miami-funded San Isidro movement. Venezuela had to be overthrown because Maduro was a brutal dictator that was oppressing the LGBTQ. The same with Iran, Russia, etc. China had to be toppled because they were carrying forth a genocide of the Muslim Uyghur minority. Real evidence of any of the accusations, like the evidence of the weapons of mass destruction, were of course never provided. More and more, the specific form that the humanitarian conquest model took was wokeism. The political theorist Marius Trotter put it nicely some years ago when he said that, facing a rising China and a resurgent Russia, the American ruling class needs a moralising crusade to motivate its counter-offensive against its enemies, both at home and abroad. Under the banners of Black Lives Matter, multicoloured pride flags and trumpets announcing the correct gender pronouns, the guns of the American empire will spread the creed of woke imperialism. But as wokeism itself was extended to such absurd extremes that no sane person could accept, it became quickly hollow as a model for war legitimation. No one cares about going to war for trans rights fought for by the USAID in Eastern countries. No one really buys into the baseless narrative that the US, which spent the first 20 years of the century bombing Muslims, killing millions of them, now cares about them in Xinjiang. And where was the proof that anything was going on in the first place? As the Cuban philosopher Ruben Zardoya has argued, when the machinations of domination become transparent, domination itself is weakened. This is what has occurred to the woke form of imperial legitimation. And to avoid the further weakening of imperial power and domination, the ruling class has had to switch course. When the consciousness of the people outmodes the woke model of imperialism, the ruling class needs a clean slate. Trump and his cohorts of fake dissident rightists carrying out an anti-woke crusade was the perfect alternative. At a time when the American people want to be dissident and anti-establishment, give them the same status quo but in the form of dissidents. Give them people who fight against the form imperialist ideology has taken in the last few years, but not against imperialism itself, not against the system that produced it in the first place. As Jackson Hinkle and Haz al-Din have previously noted, we should not be surprised if the intensification of the absurdities of wokeism were intentionally designed to prop up a dissident right that is dissident only with regard to the most superficial and depthless components of the ruling order. I've argued previously that this is an age, in the US, marked by the necessity of hegemony presenting itself as counter-hegemonic. The rulers must, at all times, manipulate the public into seeing them as subaltern, as powerless and waging a crusade against the elites themselves. From conservatives to liberals to the various Trotskyite leftists and democratic socialists, all American politics is coming more and more to take the form of dissidence. It is an aristocracy of capital that survives through the conceit of continuously struggling against itself for power. Like in Kafka's The Trial, where the court bureaucracy is reproduced precisely by presenting itself as powerless subjects subjugated by the system. The dialectic of American political authority today also takes the form of this feigning of impotence to sustain their systemic omnipotence. Power sustains itself through the pretense of powerlessness. And now we are here, in a Trump presidency that is dismantling USAID, one of the wretched henchmen of humanitarian imperialism, and that is moving towards possibly doing the same with the National Endowment for Democracy and many other institutions tied to the modern form of legitimizing and carrying out imperialist assaults. I would like to think this is a revolution against a parasitical deep state sucking the host republic dry, as Scott Ritter has suggested. I really hope it could be that, and that the debt jubilee that Ritter claims is possible with this revolution pans out, but my Marxist common sense, my understanding of the ever-evolving forms of ideologically justifying US imperialism tells me that perhaps something else is going on. A switch back to a previous form of legitimation, perhaps a turn back to the dominance of the offence-as-defence model that we saw in the Cold War and in the first decades of this century. This one certainly seems to be dominant in the discourse around China, which is presented as an existential threat to the US's security and geopolitical standing. Trump's national security advisor, Michael Waltz, has said that we are in a Cold War with the Chinese Communist Party, and that China is an existential threat to the US, with the most rapid military build-up since the 1930s. This discourse on China as an existential threat, which is very common in the foreign policy establishment, is foundational for the offence-as-defence model of legitimizing imperialism. Some analysts have suggested a return to a Monroe Doctrine-style imperialism, where one is more open about the aims of conquest for conquest's sake, veiled thinly with an appeal to a divine mandate. This is another form we have seen in the history of empires. It is clear that this model of discourse is employed in the rhetoric used for US foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. The truth, however, is that we don't know. We'll have to wait and see what actually happens. This indeterminacy isn't simply in our knowledge of the existing state of affairs. I do not think that the problem, at the moment, is one that is located in our knowledge of the world, of how US imperialism will develop in the coming years. The indeterminacy is in the world itself. The US regime is itself scrapping to figure out its next moves, to see what it can do to sustain at least a semblance of hegemony in a world where the Weltgeist is moving eastward. What I think we could be the surest of is the following. This isn't an anti-imperialist revolution, occurring within the belly of the beast via the hand of the billionaires themselves. When some of the leading billionaires, NGOs, think tanks, and financial investment firms are perfectly fine or even supportive of the Trump administration, that does not inspire confidence in the thesis that he is carrying out a great assault against the system. After all, if anyone personifies the system best, It is those profiteers who have continued making money hand over fist, irrespective of who's been in the White House. They compose the unelected body of rulers that stays the same with every change in administration. Together with the intelligence agency who serve their interests, they make up the famous deep state. When BlackRock CEO Larry Fink tells us, as he did during the presidential campaigns, that he is tired of hearing that this is the biggest election in your lifetime, and that the reality is over time, it doesn't matter. Perhaps we should listen. Instead of an assault on the imperialist system and the deep state, it is much more likely that this is a pivot toward a new form of imperialist governance and legitimation. Just like American capitalism needed to take on a new form after the Great Depression to survive, in this great crisis of empire, the US needs to do the same. Trump is here then, a figure homologous to Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR. FDR broke with the orthodoxies of free market ideologues to save capitalism. He broke with the form the system had up to then taken in order to keep it alive. Perhaps Trump, similarly, is a figure that aspires to help save American imperialism through the assault on the orthodoxy and institutions that have brought it to the brink of collapse. It is what bright statesmanship, aimed at sustaining US hegemony in the long run, would do to try to save the empire from this decline. After all, as Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa wrote in his novel The Leopard, things need to change so that they can stay the same. While I hope I am wrong, I think this is the type of change we are seeing. A change to a new form of legitimation, necessary to sustain the essential basis of US imperialism.
Wow.
You're selling your body to the government.